Nandi Cumulo stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Santon penthouse watching Johannesburg glitter below like scattered diamonds, and thought about the poetry of collapse. She was 47 years old, controlled 12 billion rand across mining, renewable energy, and strategic acquisitions, and she had learned that the most valuable assets were the ones nobody else wanted anymore. Distressed companies told stories. Failed empires revealed truths. And the smoking crater that had once been Cumulo Technologies was screaming secrets she intended to extract. The dossier on her desk was 300 pages of forensic analysis, and every page confirmed what she'd suspected from the first audit. Someone had murdered this company from the inside with surgical precision and what looked disturbingly like love. 18 months ago, Cumulo Technologies had been valued at 4 billion rand, Africa's golden child of artificial intelligence and quantum computing, the continent's answer to Silicon Valley arrogance. The founder, Elwazi Cumulo, had been on magazine covers and keynote stages, promising to revolutionize everything from healthcare to climate modeling. Now the company was worthless, the technology abandoned, the team scattered, and Elwazi himself had disappeared so completely that even Nandi's most connected investigators couldn't find him. But Nandi didn't need investigators. She had something better: patience, pattern recognition, and the kind of focused obsession that had built her empire from nothing. She'd spent 3 months analyzing every decision that had destroyed Cumulo Technologies, mapping each failure like an archaeologist reconstructing a civilization from its bones. Every terminated contract, every regulatory scandal, every technical catastrophe traced back to one person making choices that looked like incompetence but smelled like strategy. Elwazi Cumulo hadn't failed. He'd executed a controlled demolition so precise that nobody had noticed until the building was already rubble. If you've ever wondered what drives someone to destroy their own empire, or what it takes for two damaged billionaires to rebuild from ruins while falling dangerously in love, then stay with this story. Because what happens when ambition meets desire in the wreckage of a 4 billion rand empire will challenge everything you think you know about power, vulnerability, and the price of fighting for both. Her phone lit up with a message from Thembeka Dlamini, her chief of staff and the person who knew her well enough to text at 2 in the morning. Found him. Cape Town. Sending location. Nandi felt something electric move through her chest. After 3 months of searching, she was about to meet the man brilliant enough to build a 4 billion rand empire and disciplined enough to destroy it completely. She wanted to know what kind of damage created that particular combination of genius and nihilism. She wanted to understand what he'd been protecting when he'd chosen scorched earth over surrender. And more than anything, she wanted to acquire what was left and rebuild it into something that would prove whoever had forced his hand had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The address Thembeka sent was in Observatory, Cape Town's bohemian neighborhood where artists and academics lived in genteel poverty, surrounded by Victorian houses they couldn't afford to maintain. It was as far from Santon's luxury as you could get while staying in South Africa, which told Nandi everything she needed to know about Elwazi's current state of mind. Men who'd commanded billions didn't hide in Observatory unless they were trying to disappear from the world that had known them. She flew to Cape Town that morning, arrived at the address by early afternoon, and stood outside a peeling yellow house with an overgrown garden thinking this was either brilliance or breakdown. Probably both. The door opened before she could knock, and the man watching her from the threshold looked nothing like his photographs. The business magazines had shown someone in his early 40s with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never being told no, designer everything, and a smile that promised disruption. The man studying her now looked hollowed out, dangerously thin, all sharp angles and intensity that suggested he'd forgotten to eat or sleep, or do any of the basic maintenance that kept humans tethered to their bodies. He wore jeans with holes that weren't fashionable and a faded t-shirt, and his locks were longer than they'd been in any photo, pulled back in a way that emphasized the elegant bones of his face. His skin was deep umber that caught the afternoon light, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that felt like being X-rayed. "Miss Cumulo," he said, not moving from the doorway, not offering his hand. "I assume that Becca told you where to find me. That woman has always been terrifyingly efficient." "She used to work for me," Nandi said, which wasn't quite true but close enough. Then Becca had consulted for Titanium Capital before becoming El-Wazi's second-in-command at Cumulo Technologies. The fact that she'd given up his location meant she thought he needed saving more than he needed privacy. "Are you going to invite me in, or should we have this conversation on your doorstep?" El-Wazi's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Depends on what this conversation is about. If you're here to gloat about acquiring my company's corpse, we can do that right here. If you're here for something more interesting, I suppose I should offer you tea. I'm here to understand why someone brilliant enough to build Cumulo Technologies would spend 18 months systematically destroying it," Nandi said. "That seems like the kind of conversation that deserves tea." He stepped aside, and she entered a house that was shabby but clean, furnished with the kind of mismatched furniture you acquired when you'd stopped caring about appearances. The living room was dominated by whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams that looked like either genius or madness, and there were books everywhere, stacked in towers that suggested someone who read voraciously and stopped organizing around the same time they'd stopped sleeping regularly. "I'm not going to apologize for the state of things," El-Wazi said, moving to a kitchen that was barely more than a corner with appliances. "I stopped pretending to be civilized around the same time I stopped pretending my company wasn't doomed." "I'm not here for apologies," Nandi said, settling onto a couch that had seen better decades. "I'm here because I've spent 3 months analyzing your company's collapse, and nothing about it makes sense unless you did it deliberately. Which raises the question, why would someone destroy 4 billion rand in value unless staying in business was more dangerous than failure?" El-Wazi was quiet for a long moment, preparing tea with the kind of focused attention that suggested ritual was the only thing keeping him grounded. Finally, he spoke without turning around. "You're smarter than I expected." "I'm smarter than most people expect," Nandi corrected. "I built my empire by seeing patterns nobody else noticed and being willing to bet everything on being right. So tell me what I'm seeing, El-Wazi. Tell me why you killed your company." He brought tea in mismatched mugs, sat in a chair that was more duct tape than upholstery, and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and relief. "Because my family wouldn't let me walk away, and they were turning everything I built into a weapon I couldn't live with controlling." The next hour unfolded like an interrogation in reverse, El-Wazi confessing and Nandi listening, with the focused intensity of someone cataloging every detail for future use. The story he told was familiar in its bones. Brilliant son of a powerful family, groomed to be the next evolution of generational wealth, expected to modernize an empire built on mining and construction and relationships with government officials who blurred the line between legal and criminal so thoroughly that nobody bothered to distinguish anymore. The Cumulos have been connected to South African politics for 4 generations, Elwazi explained, his tea going cold while he talked. My great-grandfather knew Mandela. My grandfather funded the first post-apartheid government. My father expanded into B partnerships that were really just sophisticated bribery. And I was supposed to be the crown jewel, the tech genius who'd bring the family into the digital age, make us legitimate, give us access to international capital that wouldn't touch us otherwise. But they wanted more than legitimacy, Nandi guessed. They wanted surveillance, voter manipulation, data mining for blackmail, social media monitoring for government clients. Elwazi's hands tightened on his mug. Every piece of technology I developed, every innovation that was supposed to improve people's lives, my Uncle Manla found ways to weaponize. He wanted AI that could predict protests before they started, machine learning that could identify dissidents from their online activity, quantum algorithms that could break encryption protecting journalists and activists. And you said no. If you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own integrity, between what's expected and what's right, follow this story to see how that impossible choice reshapes everything that comes after. I tried to say no, Elwazi corrected. I fought, I argued, I threatened to walk away, but my family doesn't accept no, Ms. Cumulo. They accept negotiation, they accept delay, but they don't accept defiance. When I tried to cut them out of the company, they made it very clear that everyone I cared about would suffer. My team, my friends, anyone stupid enough to trust me. Nandi leaned back, processing. This was bigger than she'd anticipated, more dangerous, more connected to systems of power that extended well beyond one family's corruption. So you destroyed it all before they could use it. I made it radioactive, Elwazi said quietly. Every failed contract, every scandal, every investigation, I engineered it to make Cumulo technology so toxic that even my family would cut their losses. It worked. Eventually they walked away. But it cost me everything. My reputation. My team who thought I'd just lost my mind. The technology I spent 15 years developing, now worthless because I deliberately sabotaged it. And your uncle, Manla Cumulo, what did he do when you destroyed billions in family assets? Elwazi's expression went very still, very cold. He told me that if I ever tried to rebuild, if I ever emerged from whatever hole I'd crawled into, he would finish what he started. That destruction was mercy compared to what he'd do if I became a problem again. The silence that followed felt heavy, dense with all the implications Nandi was calculating. This wasn't just about acquiring a failed company. This was about going to war with one of South Africa's most powerful families, the kind of war where winning meant exposure and losing meant elimination. Most people would walk away. Most people would recognize this as radioactive and move on to safer investments. Nandi had never been most people. What if I told you I want to acquire Cumulo Technologies? She said quietly. What if I told you I want to rebuild everything you destroyed, and I want you to help me do it? Elwazi stared at her like she'd suggested they rob a bank together. You're insane. I'm ambitious, Nandi corrected. There's a difference. Your technology is still valuable, Elwazi. The patents alone are worth hundreds of millions if developed properly. The team you built can be reassembled. The vision you had, AI that serves communities instead of surveilling them, technology that empowers instead of controls, that's still viable. It's still revolutionary. It just needs someone with enough resources and enough anger to fight your family's attempts to bury it. They'll come after you, Elwazi warned. The moment you start rebuilding what I destroyed, Manla will mobilize everything he has to crush you. Legal warfare, media assassination, political pressure. He has connections in government, law enforcement, regulatory agencies. He can make your life a nightmare. I've survived nightmares before, Nandi said calmly. I grew up in Soweto watching my mother clean houses for families who treated her like she was invisible. I built my first company with borrowed money and threats from loan sharks. I fought hostile takeovers, gender discrimination, and competitors who thought my success was a fluke. Your uncle doesn't scare me, Elwazi. He interests me. Because men like him think women like me should stay in our lane, acquire safe companies, never challenge the systems they built to keep themselves on top. She leaned forward. I've made a career of proving them wrong. This is just another opportunity. Something shifted in Elwazi's expression, moved from skepticism towards something that might have been hope. What exactly are you proposing? Nandi pulled out a folder she'd brought with her, slid it across the salvaged coffee table between them. 300 million rand for complete acquisition of Cumulo Technologies. All patents, all intellectual property, all existing contracts and liabilities. You walk away with enough money to disappear permanently if that's what you want. Or, she paused, let the alternative hang in the air. You partner with me to rebuild it, not as Cumulo Technologies, something new. Something that's ours, not theirs. I provide the capital and political protection. You provide the technical expertise and insider knowledge of where every landmine is buried. Together, we build something revolutionary and shove it so far down your uncle's throat that he chokes on his own corruption. Elwazi opened the folder, scanned the terms with the kind of focused attention that suggested he actually read contracts instead of just signing them. Nandi watched his face, cataloged every microexpression, and tried to ignore the fact that something about this man's intensity was making her pulse spike in ways that had nothing to do with business strategy. You're offering me 15% equity in the restructured company, he said finally, looking up. With performance benchmarks that increase it to 25%, Nandi clarified. I don't want an employee, Elwazi. I want a partner who's as invested in success as I am. Someone who will fight as hard as I do to prove that your family's corruption isn't the only way to build power in this country. And if they destroy us both, if Manla mobilizes everything he has, and we end up as cautionary tales about what happens when you challenge the Cumulo family. Nandi smiled, and it was the smile that had made competitors nervous and allies cautious. Then we'll fail spectacularly, and at least we'll have tried to build something clean in a dirty world. But Elwazi, I don't fail often. And when I do, I make sure the lesson I teach is more valuable than the victory I lost. He stared at her for a long moment, and Nandi felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch. She was used to men looking at her. She was beautiful, powerful, rich enough that her presence reorganized a room's gravity. But this was different. Elwazi was looking at her like he was seeing something he'd thought didn't exist anymore, like he'd forgotten that people could be both fierce and unafraid. Counterproposal, he said finally. 18% equity baseline, 28 with benchmarks. Full autonomy over technology development and team building. A seat on Titanium Capital's board, not just the subsidiary. And we call the company Phoenix Quantum because we're building from ashes and the technology is quantum computing, not just AI. Nandi felt something dangerous bloom in her chest. Excitement, yes, but also recognition that this negotiation felt less like business and more like the beginning of something that could consume them both. 16% baseline, 26 with benchmarks. You get technology autonomy and hearing control. The board seat converts from advisory to full membership after 18 months of proven performance, and Phoenix Quantum is perfect. El-Wazi extended his hand across the table. "You're a shark, Ms. Cumulo." She took it, felt the calluses on his palm that suggested he still built things with his hands, felt the current that ran between them like voltage looking for ground. "I prefer apex predator, and if we're going to be partners, you should call me Nandi." "Nandi," he repeated, and the way her name sounded in his voice made something low in her stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with business. "I think you just made the most dangerous deal of your life." "Good," she said, still holding his hand longer than was strictly professional. "I've been bored." If you've ever wondered what it takes to rebuild something from ruins, to take calculated risks that could cost everything, stay with this story because the real battle is just beginning, and the stakes are about to get exponentially higher. The thing about acquiring a company built on deliberate failure was that due diligence became archaeology, each layer revealing another secret, another scar, another moment when someone chose destruction over compromise. Nandi threw herself into it with the obsessive focus that had built her empire, spending 16-hour days reconstructing Cumulo Technologies' death so they could plan Phoenix Quantum's resurrection. And because she'd insisted El-Wazi be integral to the process, that meant 16-hour days together, sitting across tables and walking through abandoned server farms, and standing in empty offices that still smelled like broken dreams. What she hadn't anticipated was how intimate the work would become. El-Wazi didn't just explain what he'd destroyed, he explained why, and every answer revealed another layer of damage. He showed her the government contract he'd deliberately failed by introducing code errors he knew would trigger security reviews, costing his company 200 million rand and 8 months of development time. He walked her through the investor presentation, where he'd provided nonsensical financial projections specifically designed to make them flee. He stood in what had been his data center and described the night he'd manually corrupted 3 years of machine learning training data because his uncle had demanded access to use it for voter suppression in the upcoming elections. "I stood here for 6 hours, El-Wazi said, his voice distant with memory. They were in a Cape Town warehouse that still housed some of Cumulo Technologies' server equipment, sunlight streaming through broken windows to illuminate dust motes that looked like suspended time. Just watching progress bars, watching years of work delete itself. I kept thinking this is what it feels like to murder something you love." Nandi set down the inventory report she'd been reviewing, studied him with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for balance sheets. "Did you love it? The company?" "I loved what it could have been," El-Wazi said quietly. "I loved the idea that we could build technology that actually helped people instead of controlling them. I loved my team, the developers and engineers who believed we were changing the world. I loved walking into our offices every morning feeling like we were building the future. He paused, met her eyes directly. And then I loved it enough to kill it before it became something monstrous. The silence that followed felt dense, weighted with things neither of them was saying. Nandi understood that kind of love, the kind that required sacrifice, that demanded you become the instrument of destruction for what you cherished most. She'd felt it when she'd had to lay off 80 people during her first company's restructuring, knowing it would save the business but destroy their livelihoods. She'd felt it when she'd walked away from a man she'd almost married because he'd wanted her to choose between him and her ambition, as if love could only exist in the absence of power. "Your uncle," she said, redirecting to safer territory. "Tell me about Manla, not the business profile, the personal reality." Elwazi's expression darkened in a way that made the warehouse feel colder. Manla is what happens when you give a sociopath 4 generations of wealth and total immunity from consequences. He's charming when it serves him, ruthless when charm fails, and absolutely convinced that the Cumulo family is entitled to whatever it wants because we've always taken it. He raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 16. Which means he spent 12 years teaching me that power is the only currency that matters and conscience is a luxury poor people can't afford. "Sounds like he taught you well," Nandi observed, watching Elwazi's jaw tighten. "He taught me what I didn't want to become," Elwazi corrected. "Everything I built, everything I destroyed, it was all an attempt to prove I wasn't him. That I could have success without corruption, that I could build something clean in a world designed to reward dirt." He laughed, bitter and sharp. "You see how well that worked." "You saved people," Nandi pointed out. "You destroyed billions in value to prevent your technology from being weaponized. That's not failure, Elwazi. That's integrity so expensive most people can't afford it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Nandi felt the weight of his attention like a physical touch, warm and dangerous and impossible to ignore. "Why do you keep doing that?" "Doing what?" "Finding the best interpretation of my choices. Most people think I'm either incompetent or insane. You keep making it sound noble." Nandi considered deflecting, maintaining the professional distance that kept her safe. Instead, she heard herself say, "Because I recognize it. The choice between who you are and who the world demands you be. I've made that choice 100 times. Every time it costs something." "What did it cost you?" His voice had dropped lower, intimate despite the cavernous warehouse. She thought about her 20s, working 100-hour weeks while her friends married and had children. Her 30s, building empire while lovers came and went, none of them capable of wanting her and her ambition simultaneously. Her 40s, waking up in luxury and absolute isolation. "Everything that wasn't work," she said finally. "Everyone who couldn't love me and my success at the same time. Every soft moment sacrificed to stay sharp." "Nandi." He said her name like a revelation, like he'd discovered something precious he hadn't known he was looking for, and she had to look away because the tenderness in his voice was too much, too dangerous, too likely to make her want things she'd learned to live without. "We should focus," she said, reaching for the safety of spreadsheets and strategy. "Your uncle's political connections. Walk me through them systematically." Elwazi let her redirect, but she could feel the shift in the air between them, the knowledge that they'd both revealed more than intended, and the boundary between professional partnership and something far more complicated was starting to blur in ways neither could control. Over the following weeks, as they built Phoenix Quantum from Cumulo Technologies' bones, Nandi discovered that working with El Wazi was like conducting electricity, dangerous and necessary, and impossible to insulate against. He was brilliant in ways that made her breath catch, seeing patterns in data her entire analytics team had missed, designing solutions with an elegance that was almost artistic. But more than that, he saw her in ways she'd forgotten to let people see. When she snapped at a consultant for missing a deadline, El Wazi quietly reminded her that brilliance didn't license cruelty. When she worked until 3 in the morning reviewing contracts, he appeared with food and insisted she eat while he explained what made quantum computing revolutionary in language she could understand without condescension. When she armored herself in designer suits and diamond jewelry and the untouchable perfection that kept the world at distance, he looked past all of it and asked how she was actually feeling. It was terrifying. It was addictive. And Nandi knew she should stop it before the professional became personal, before partnership became something that could hurt them both. She didn't stop it. The first time she realized they'd crossed a line was during a late-night strategy session in her Cape Town office. They were wargaming Mandla's inevitable attacks, mapping legal strategies and media responses and financial defenses. It was past midnight, the city quiet below them, just the two of them and whiteboards covered in scenarios and coffee gone cold hours ago. "He'll target your reputation first," El Wazi was saying, packing in front of the windows in a way that made her track his movement like prey. "That's his pattern. Character assassination before legal assault. He'll find something from your past, twist it out of context, feed it to journalists who owe him favors, make you look corrupt or reckless or uppity," Nandi finished. "That's what they call women like me who refuse to apologize for success. Uppity, aggressive, difficult." El Wazi stopped packing, turned to face her. "Does it bother you, what they say?" "It did," she admitted. "When I was younger, I thought if I was perfect enough, smart enough, successful enough, they'd stop questioning whether I deserved to be in the room. Now I know they'll question me regardless, so I might as well give them something worth talking about." "You're magnificent," he said simply, and the compliment hit her like a blow because there was no agenda behind it, no manipulation, just honest observation delivered with the kind of reverence usually reserved for art. Nandi felt her heart rate spike, felt heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the office climate control. "That's inappropriate," she said, but her voice came out softer than intended, missing the sharp edge that would have made it a real warning. "I know," El Wazi agreed, but he didn't take it back, didn't look away, just stood there watching her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. "I should maintain professional boundaries. It's just difficult when you're—" He stopped himself. "When I'm what?" Nandi heard herself ask, standing up from her desk, drawn toward him by something that felt inevitable and catastrophic in equal measure. "When you're the most extraordinary woman I've ever met and I can't stop noticing everything about you," El Wazi said, his voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. "How your mind works, how you solve problems others don't even see, how you look when you're thinking through something complex, this expression like you're having a conversation with yourself and winning. How you've spent decades building armor so effective nobody can get close enough to hurt you, and I keep wondering what it would take to make you trust someone enough to take it off." The air between them felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Nandi knew she should shut this down, remind him they were partners, maintain the distance that kept her safe. Instead, she found herself moving closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of someone who actually saw her instead of just her achievements. "El-Wazi," she said, and even his name felt intimate in her mouth. "We can't do this." "I know," he said, but he didn't move away either, and she could see his pulse jumping at his throat, could feel the heat radiating from his skin even though they weren't touching. "But Nandi, I've already destroyed one company to escape corruption and control. I'm not interested in destroying this by pretending I don't feel what I feel. Life's too short, and we're both too old to waste time on cowardice." "I'm older than you," she tried to find reasons, build walls, create distance. "I'm your business partner. The power dynamic alone makes this." "I'm 42 years old," El-Wazi interrupted gently. "More than old enough to make my own decisions about who I'm attracted to. And the power dynamic cuts both ways, Nandi. Yes, you're acquiring my company, but I'm the only person who knows how to rebuild it, which means you need me as much as I need you. This isn't exploitation. This is two people who have both been alone too long, recognizing something rare when they see it." She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain control, wanted to pretend she didn't feel the same magnetic pull that had her standing less than a foot away from him in an empty office at midnight. "What are we recognizing?" His hand came up slowly, giving her time to step back, to retreat to safety. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek, calloused and warm and impossibly gentle, and Nandi felt the touch all the way through her body. "Possibility," he said quietly. "The chance that maybe loneliness isn't the required price for success. That maybe we could build something professional and something personal without destroying each other in the process." "That's naive," Nandi whispered, but she didn't pull away from his touch. "Probably," El-Wazi agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw in a way that made her breath catch. "But I spent 18 months being ruthlessly practical, destroying everything I built to escape my family's corruption. Maybe I'm ready to be a little naive if it means actually living instead of just surviving." Nandi closed her eyes, fighting the want rising in her like a tide she couldn't control. She'd built her entire life on discipline, choosing strategic advantage over emotional need, staying sharp and alone and safe. This man was offering her something she'd convinced herself she didn't want anymore: vulnerability, connection, the terrifying possibility of being seen and chosen for who she was instead of what she could provide. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, opening her eyes to find him watching her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. "I don't know how to want someone without it becoming a weakness they use against me." "Then we'll figure it out together," El-Wazi said simply. "No games, no manipulation, just honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. And if it destroys our partnership, if it ruins Phoenix Quantum before we even launch." His hand dropped from her face, but he didn't step back. "Then we'll deal with that if it happens. But Nandi, you deserve someone who tells you the truth instead of what you want to hear. And the truth is, I think you're brilliant and beautiful and terrifying. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since you walked into my house and offered to fight my family's wars like it was the most natural thing in the world." She kissed him then, closed the distance, and claimed his mouth with an urgency that surprised them both. His arms came around her immediately, pulling her closer, and Nandi heard herself make a sound that was embarrassingly close to relief. His mouth was soft and demanding at once, patient and urgent, and she couldn't remember the last time she'd wanted to touch someone this badly, this completely. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Nandi tried to find something cutting to say, some way to regain control and distance. Instead, she found herself laughing, surprised and a little hysterical. "We are absolutely going to regret this." "Possibly," Elwazi said, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture so intimate it made her chest ache. "But I'm tired of making decisions based on fear. Aren't you?" She was. God help her, she was so tired of being afraid of wanting more than work and success, and the cold comfort of achievement. "We take this slow," she said, pulling back enough to look at him directly. "No public displays, no office complications. We figure out if this is real or just adrenaline and proximity before we blow up both our lives." "Agreed," Elwazi said, smiling in a way that suggested he thought her rules were adorable and destined to fail. "Slow, professional, absolutely no complications." They both knew he was lying. The complications began exactly 3 days later, delivered in the form of Sibusai's Madden appearing in Nandi's Johannesburg office without appointment or warning. Sibusai's was another self-made billionaire, a former struggle hero turned mining magnate who controlled enough mineral rights to influence commodity prices and enough political connections to shape policy. He was also, Nandi knew from 20 years of intersecting business circles, deeply connected to the Cumulo family through both business partnerships and family ties. His appearance meant Manla had mobilized his forces faster than anticipated. "Nandi," Sibusai's said, settling into a chair without invitation. He was in his 60s, silver-haired and elegant, moving with the comfortable authority of someone used to being welcomed everywhere. "I've wanted to meet with you for some time. Your acquisition of Cumulo Technologies has caused considerable interest in certain circles." "Has it?" Nandi kept her voice neutral, not offering refreshments, just waiting for him to state his business so she could refuse it and move on. "I understand you've partnered with Elwazi Cumulo to rebuild the company," Sibusai's continued. "Ambitious, possibly brilliant, definitely dangerous. I wanted to offer you some friendly advice." "I wasn't aware we were friends." Sibusai's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We could be. We should be. We're both successful black entrepreneurs who have built empires in a country that wasn't designed to allow our success. We understand how the game works, how power functions, how to navigate systems that were created to exclude us. Which is why I'm here to tell you that partnering with Elwazi Cumulo is a mistake that will cost you more than you can imagine." Nandi leaned back in her chair, studied him with the kind of level assessment that made most people uncomfortable. Because Elwazi destroyed his own company rather than share control with his family. Because he's unstable, self-destructive, and completely incapable of maintaining relationships that don't serve his immediate interests. Because his uncle Manla has resources and connections you're underestimating. Sibusai's leaned forward, and his voice took on an edge that made the temperature drop. "And because this upcoming election matters more than you realize, Nandi. The Minister of Digital Infrastructure position is up for appointment. The contracts associated with that position are worth tens of billions over the next decade. Manla has been positioning the Cumulo family to capture those contracts for years. Your attempt to rebuild El-Wazi's company threatens that positioning. Good, Nandi said simply. I've always enjoyed threatening entrenched interests. You're being naive, Sibusaizo said, and now the pretense of friendliness was gone, replaced by naked warning. You think you can compete against families who have been shaping South African politics for generations. You think your money and your ambition are enough to protect you when people with real power decide you're a problem. You're a clever woman, Nandi. Impressive, even. But you're playing a game whose rules you don't understand. I've heard this speech before, Nandi said calmly. Usually from men who are surprised when I win anyway. Tell Manla that his attempt at intimidation is noted and dismissed. Tell him that I'm acquiring Cumulo technologies regardless of his preferences. And tell him that if he comes after me or El-Wazi, I'll make sure the documentation of his corrupt practices becomes very public very quickly. Sibusaizo stood, and the movement had an edge of threat to it. You're making enemies you can't afford, Nandi, people who can destroy everything you've built. Let them try, Nandi said. I built my empire by being willing to fight when others wouldn't. Your warning is appreciated and ignored. You can show yourself out. After he left, Nandi sat in the silence and felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Because Sibusaizo's visit confirmed what she'd suspected. This wasn't just about a single acquisition anymore. This was about political power, government contracts, and systems of corruption that extended well beyond one family's interests. Rebuilding Phoenix Quantum meant threatening a network of people who'd grown wealthy and powerful by controlling the intersection of technology and government policy. Most people would retreat. Most people would recognize this as unwinnable and walk away. Nandi had never been most people. And if you're someone who believes that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem impossible, that real change requires being willing to risk everything, then understand that what comes next will test every assumption about power, loyalty, and the price of fighting for something worth protecting. She called El-Wazi immediately, told him about Sibusaizo's visit, and watched his face through the video call as he processed the implications. They'd been careful about keeping their relationship private, professional in public contexts, but looking at him now, she felt the familiar pull of wanting to be in the same room, touching instead of just watching through screens. He's mobilizing faster than I expected, El-Wazi said, and she could hear the tension in his voice. Sibusaizo wouldn't come directly to you unless Manla was feeling genuinely threatened. That's either good news because we're hurting him, or bad news because he's about to escalate significantly. Probably both, Nandi agreed. The question is what form the escalation takes: legal, media, political pressure. All three, El-Wazi said grimly. That's his pattern. Multiple fronts simultaneously, overwhelming opponents before they can organize effective defense. And Nandi, he paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. You need to understand that what Sibusaizo said about the Minister of Digital Infrastructure position is true. The government is restructuring how it awards technology contracts, and whoever controls that ministry controls tens of billions in spending over the next decade. Manla has been positioning for years to make sure the Cumulo family captures that opportunity. By using your technology, Nandi guessed. By using technology, I specifically destroyed to prevent exactly that use, El-Wazi confirmed. The surveillance capabilities, the voter modeling, the social media manipulation, All of it was designed to give whoever controlled it unprecedented power over political and social narratives. I sabotaged it because I refused to let my family turn democratic infrastructure into authoritarian control mechanisms. Nandi thought about that, about the scale of what they were actually fighting. This wasn't just corporate warfare anymore. This was about whether South Africa's digital future would be shaped by people trying to expand democratic participation or people trying to consolidate authoritarian control. Then we need to move faster than they can respond, she said. Launch Phoenix Quantum publicly, announce our partnerships, make it clear that the technology exists and isn't under Cumulo family control. If we can get enough momentum before they can fully mobilize, it becomes harder for them to shut us down without obvious political interference. That's risky, Elwazi warned. Going public before we're fully prepared means exposing vulnerabilities they can exploit. Staying quiet means giving them time to eliminate us privately before anyone knows we exist, Nandi countered. I'd rather fight publicly than disappear quietly. Wouldn't you? He smiled at that, genuine and a little fierce. I destroyed my own company and went into hiding for 18 months to avoid fighting. Meeting you has been either the best or worst influence on my risk tolerance. Probably both, Nandi agreed, and felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with business strategy and everything to do with the fact that she could see him fighting back instead of retreating, could see hope replacing the exhaustion that had defined him when they'd met. They spent the next 2 weeks moving at a pace that felt both exhilarating and unsustainable, assembling what they needed for a public launch. Elwazi reassembled core members of his original team, developers and engineers who'd thought him insane during Cumulo Technologies' collapse and were shocked to discover his failure had been strategic. Nandi leveraged her political relationships to secure meetings with government officials interested in alternatives to the Cumulo family's technological dominance. Together, they built presentations and demonstrations that showcased Phoenix Quantum's capabilities, while carefully avoiding any suggestion of the surveillance applications that had motivated Elwazi's original sabotage. And through it all, they navigated the increasingly complicated reality of being business partners who couldn't stop touching each other. Late nights in the office would end with Elwazi's hands in her hair and her back against locked doors and kisses that felt like drowning. Strategy sessions would derail when their hands brushed over documents, and suddenly they were pressed together in her executive bathroom, breathing hard and trying to remember why they'd promised to take this slow. Video calls that were supposed to be about technical specifications would end with both of them staring at each other through screens, saying goodnight 3 times before finally disconnecting. It was intoxicating. It was reckless. And Nandi knew it couldn't last, knew that eventually reality would intrude in the form of Mandla's attacks or media attention, or the fundamental impossibility of maintaining both a business partnership and this growing obsession. The intrusion came on a Wednesday morning, delivered as a front-page headline. Titanium Capital CEO's secret romance, love or hostile takeover. Nandi read the article in her office, felt her hands shaking with rage and shame, and the horrible recognition that she should have anticipated this. The piece was a masterpiece of innuendo, suggesting she'd seduced Elwazi to gain control of his technology, that their relationship had begun before the acquisition, that she'd exploited a vulnerable man recovering from professional disaster. It included quotes from anonymous sources describing El-Wazi as emotionally fragile and Nandi as predatory. It questioned the ethics of a woman in her late 40s pursuing a relationship with her business partner. It implied that everything about Phoenix Quantum was built on manipulation and lies. Her phone rang. El-Wazi. "Don't read the article," he said immediately. "Too late. Nandi, it's all lies. Anonymous sources, selective facts, designed to humiliate you and undermine us. Nobody who actually knows us will believe it." "It doesn't matter if they believe it," Nandi said, her voice flat with anger. "It matters that it's out there, that my investors and board members and everyone I do business with will read it and wonder if there's truth underneath the lies. This is exactly what Sibu Size warned about. Character assassination before legal assault." "So we fight back," El-Wazi said, his voice firm. "We don't let Manla control the narrative." "Fight back how?" Nandi heard herself ask, feeling exhaustion settle over her like a weight. "By confirming the relationship and making myself look like I mixed business with pleasure. By denying it and making you look like you were used. There's no winning move here, El-Wazi. Manla has already won this round." The silence on the other end of the line felt heavy, crushing. Then, "I'm coming to your office. We're not having this conversation over the phone." He arrived 30 minutes later, looking furious and determined in equal measure. Nandi had spent those 30 minutes fielding calls from board members and investors, each conversation a variation on the same theme. Concern about her judgment, questions about the acquisition's legitimacy, suggestions that perhaps she should reconsider her partnership with El-Wazi before the scandal damaged Titanium Capital's reputation irreparably. By the time El-Wazi walked through her door, Nandi felt hollowed out, exhausted in ways that sleep wouldn't fix. When public scrutiny threatens to destroy what you've built in private, the question becomes whether to hide or fight back. Like this, if you've ever had to defend something precious against a world determined to tear it down. "We need to make a decision," she said before he could speak. "Either we end this, the personal part, not the business partnership, and try to salvage Phoenix Quantum by presenting a united professional front, or we acknowledge the relationship publicly and accept that doing so will likely destroy both our reputations and possibly the company." "That's not a decision," El-Wazi said, moving closer. "That's surrendering to my uncle's intimidation tactics. Nandi, he's trying to make you choose between your personal happiness and your professional credibility because he knows that's the choice that will break you. Don't let him win by accepting his framing." "I'm not accepting his framing," Nandi said, hearing the exhaustion in her own voice. "I'm being realistic about the cost of continuing this relationship while trying to fight a war against one of South Africa's most powerful families. I can't do both, El-Wazi. I don't have the energy or resources to defend our relationship and build Phoenix Quantum and protect my empire all simultaneously. Something has to give." "Then let your empire give," El-Wazi said, and the words hit her like a slap. "Nandi, you've spent 20 years building Titanium Capital. You've proven everything you needed to prove about your competence and your power. Maybe it's time to prioritize what actually makes you happy instead of what maintains your reputation." "You're asking me to choose you over everything I've built," Nandi said, and she could hear the accusation in her voice, the hurt. "I'm asking you to choose happiness over image," El-Wazi corrected. "I'm asking you to believe that you can be both powerful and vulnerable, both successful and in love, without those things being mutually exclusive. And I'm asking you to trust that people who matter will see the truth instead of believing manufactured scandal." "That's naive," Nandi said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing. "Maybe," Elwazi agreed, moving close enough to touch her, hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "But I spent 18 months being ruthlessly realistic, destroying everything I built because I couldn't see any other option. Meeting you made me believe that maybe there are options besides destruction or surrender, that maybe we could fight and win and be happy at the same time. Was I wrong about that?" Nandi closed her eyes, felt tears threaten that she absolutely refused to shed. "I don't know. I don't know how to be both strong and vulnerable. I don't know how to want you without it making me weak." "Then let me be strong enough for both of us right now," Elwazi said quietly. "Let me be the one who fights while you figure out what you actually want instead of what you think you should want." And despite everything, the scandal, the strategic nightmare, the certainty that this relationship was going to cost her more than she could afford, Nandi found herself leaning into him, letting him hold her, accepting comfort she hadn't realized she needed. They stood like that for a long moment, and then Elwazi pulled back enough to look at her directly. "I have an idea. It's probably insane, definitely risky, but it might shift the power dynamic enough to give us breathing room." "What kind of idea?" "We hold a press conference," Elwazi said. "We acknowledge our relationship publicly, but we also use it as an opportunity to expose the corruption Manla has been engaged in for decades. We make it clear that the attack on us isn't about ethics or propriety. It's about a powerful family trying to silence threats to their control over government technology contracts. We turn this from a scandal about our personal lives into a scandal about systemic corruption." Nandi stared at him, processing. It was audacious, aggressive, and exactly the kind of move that could either save them or destroy them completely. "That means exposing everything. Your family's connections, their illegal activities, the attempts to weaponize your technology, all of it." "I know," Elwazi said quietly. "It means burning bridges that can never be rebuilt. It means making enemies of people who have been family, who raised me, who I loved despite everything. But Nandi, I've already destroyed one company to escape their control. I'm not going to destroy us by staying silent while they assassinate our characters." She thought about it, about all the risks and possibilities, about what it would mean to go on offense instead of playing defense, about what it would cost and what they might gain. And somewhere in that calculation she realized that this was what partnership actually looked like. Not one person protecting the other, but both of them fighting together, taking turns being strong when the other one wavered. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it. Let's hold the press conference and tell our story before they can finish writing theirs. If you've stayed with us through scandal and strategy, through the complicated mess of building something while fighting for it, then you understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to accept the narrative someone else is writing about your life. Comment below if you've ever had to reclaim your own story against powerful opposition." The press conference they called for the following Monday was attended by every major business publication in South Africa, political reporters who covered government corruption, and gossip journalists who smelled scandal. Nandi stood at the podium in her Santon headquarters, Elwazi beside her, and prepared to control the narrative before it destroyed them both. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice calm and authoritative despite the adrenaline making her hands want to shake. I've called this conference to address recent media speculation about my relationship with El-Wazi Cumulo and our business partnership through Phoenix Quantum. Rather than allow innuendo and anonymous sources to define our story, I'm choosing transparency. She proceeded to lay out the timeline with clinical precision. The initial acquisition offer, the decision to partner rather than simply acquire assets, the development of both professional and personal connection. She didn't apologize for falling in love with her business partner. She didn't justify the age difference or the power dynamics. She simply stated facts and challenged anyone to find ethical fault with two consenting adults choosing each other. Then she pivoted, and her voice took on an edge that made several reporters sit up straighter. I'd also like to address the coordinated campaign to undermine Phoenix Quantum and damage both Mr. Cumulo's reputation and my own. Over the past 3 months, we've faced patent challenges from shell companies with opaque ownership, regulatory scrutiny timed suspiciously with our commercial preparations, and media coverage relying heavily on anonymous sources with clear agenda. She paused, made eye contact with specific journalists she knew were on Mandla's payroll. We've now traced funding for these attacks to a network of companies controlled by Mandla Cumulo, El-Wazi's uncle, and head of the Cumulo family business empire. What you're witnessing isn't organic concern about our business practices. It's intimidation designed to punish El-Wazi for refusing to participate in his family's corrupt activities. The room exploded with questions, but Nandi wasn't finished. We're filing legal action against every entity that has targeted Phoenix Quantum with baseless challenges. We're providing law enforcement with documentation of bribery, corruption, and regulatory manipulation involving the Cumulo family empire. And we're making public a comprehensive report detailing 4 generations of illegal activity that has allowed the Cumulo family to accumulate wealth and political influence through methods that should disgust anyone who cares about ethical governance. She turned to El-Wazi then, saw his expression of shock and admiration, and something that looked like liberation. This was his nightmare and his freedom at once. Exposing his family meant burning bridges that could never be rebuilt, but it also meant reclaiming his story, refusing to be defined by their corruption. El-Wazi stepped forward to the microphone. My name is El-Wazi Cumulo, and I deliberately destroyed my own company 18 months ago because my family was forcing me to turn revolutionary technology into surveillance and manipulation tools. I've cooperated fully with Ms. Cumulo's investigation because I believe South African business and politics will only advance when we stop tolerating the kind of corruption my family represents. This will be uncomfortable. People with power will be implicated. Political relationships will be strained, but accountability matters more than comfort, and integrity matters more than influence. The press conference continued for another 90 minutes, journalists shouting questions about specific allegations, about Nandi's personal life, about Phoenix Quantum's technology. She answered some, deflected others, and throughout maintained the kind of controlled authority that had built her empire. When it finally ended, she and El-Wazi retreated to her office, closed the door, and stared at each other. That was either brilliant or the most spectacularly self-destructive thing we've ever done, El-Wazi said finally. Possibly both, Nandi agreed, already seeing her phone light up with reactions, some supportive, some critical, all intense. I just declared war on one of South Africa's most powerful families and made our relationship public in a way that guarantees continuous scrutiny. So yes, spectacularly self-destructive is definitely possible. El-Wazi crossed the room, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her with the kind of gratitude that felt like worship. "Thank you," he said against her mouth, "for fighting for us, for choosing transparency over protection, for being brave enough to make yourself vulnerable." "Thank me when we survive this," Nandi murmured, but she let herself lean into him, let herself take comfort instead of just offering it. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Several Titanium Capital board members demanded emergency meetings. 3 institutional investors announced reviews of their positions. Political allies who'd benefited from Cumulo family support started distancing themselves from Nandi's accusations. And the media coverage intensified, editorials questioning her judgment, her motives, whether personal feelings had compromised her usually impeccable business instincts. But something else happened too. Journalists who'd been afraid to investigate the Cumulo family now had cover. Prosecutors who'd looked the other way because of political pressure suddenly found motivation. And Phoenix Quantum's technology, which had been overshadowed by scandal, started getting serious attention from clients who appreciated that Nandi and El-Wazi were willing to fight corruption instead of accommodating it. Support materialized from unexpected quarters. An investigative journalist who'd initially questioned the acquisition called to apologize, admitting pressure from sources connected to Manla. Several of Nandi's competitors publicly praised her courage even while privately probably celebrating her distraction. A coalition of women business leaders issued a statement supporting her right to have a personal life without it being weaponized against professional credibility. And 2 weeks after the press conference, Manla Cumulo was arrested on corruption charges. The evidence Nandi and El-Wazi had provided finally giving prosecutors enough ammunition to move against someone who'd seemed untouchable for decades. Watching the arrest footage on the news, Nandi felt something settle in her chest that might have been satisfaction or might have been exhaustion. They'd survived the first major battle. But she knew from experience that wounded enemies were the most dangerous kind, and Manla had resources and connections that extended well beyond what they'd exposed. "We're not safe yet," she said to El-Wazi that night. They were in her Bantry Bay penthouse, Cape Town spread below them like scattered promises. "Manla will fight this. His lawyers, his political allies, everyone who benefits from the current corrupt system, they'll all mobilize to protect him." "Let them," El-Wazi said, pulling her closer on the couch where they'd collapsed after another 16-hour day. "We've already proven he's not invincible. That's enough for now." "Is it?" Nandi asked, turning to look at him. "Is exposing him enough when the systems that enabled him are still in place? When the corruption extends well beyond one family?" El-Wazi was quiet for a moment, his fingers playing absently with her hair. "I think we have to be realistic about what 2 people can accomplish, even 2 people as stubborn and well-resourced as us. We can't fix systemic corruption single-handedly, but we can build something clean. We can prove that it's possible to succeed without participating in the dirt. And maybe that example matters more than taking down every corrupt actor individually." It wasn't the answer Nandi wanted. She was used to winning completely, not partially. But she recognized the wisdom in it. They could either spend the next decade fighting corruption everywhere they found it and burn out in the process, or they could focus on building Phoenix Quantum into something revolutionary and let that success speak for itself. "When did you become the wise one in this partnership?" she asked, trying for levity. "Probably around the same time you became the one willing to take risks for happiness instead of just for profit," Elwazi countered, smiling. "We're corrupting each other in the best possible ways. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about destroying every enemy, but about building something so good it makes their corruption look obsolete." Follow for more stories about people choosing to build rather than just fight. Phoenix Quantum launched its first major product 3 months later, a quantum computing platform designed for secure communications and democratic governance applications. The irony of using technology to enable transparency instead of surveillance wasn't lost on anyone, and the media coverage framed it as poetic justice. Nandi stood beside Elwazi at the launch event, their hands intertwined in a way that was both professional and intimate, and felt something that might have been peace. They'd survived. Not unscathed, Phoenix Quantum was still rebuilding. Several key partnerships had been damaged. Nandi's reputation would always carry the complexity of this chapter, and Elwazi's relationship with his family was irreparably destroyed. But they'd survived together, and that was the victory that actually mattered. The epilogue to their war came 6 months later, delivered as news that Manlacumulo had accepted a plea deal that would see him imprisoned for corruption, while dismantling much of the family business empire. Elwazi watched the coverage in Nandi's penthouse, his expression unreadable. "How do you feel?" Nandi asked quietly, settling beside him. "Relieved," Elwazi said after a long moment. "Guilty, sad, angry, all of it simultaneously." He turned to look at her. "He raised me, taught me everything I know about business, even if the lessons were cautionary. And now he's going to prison because I provided evidence. That's complicated." "It is," Nandi agreed, taking his hand. "But you did the right thing. You chose integrity over family loyalty. That takes courage." "Or selfishness," Elwazi countered. "I destroyed my uncle to protect what I wanted. That's not exactly noble." "You destroyed corruption to build something clean," Nandi corrected. "There's a difference. And Elwazi, your uncle made his own choices. You're not responsible for the consequences of his actions, only for your own." They sat in silence watching the sun set over Cape Town, processing the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. Phoenix Quantum grew over the following year, slowly at first and then with accelerating momentum as their technology proved itself, and clients learned to trust they were building something sustainable. Nandi and Elwazi found a rhythm balancing professional partnership with personal intimacy, though it remained complicated, messy, and occasionally combustible. They fought about strategy and vision, and whose turn it was to compromise. They surprised each other with tenderness and support, and the kind of understanding that only came from seeing each other at their worst and choosing to stay anyway. Nandi learned that vulnerability wasn't the same as weakness, that letting someone see her afraid or uncertain or exhausted didn't diminish her power, but actually expanded it by making room for connection alongside control. Elwazi learned that building something didn't have to mean eventual destruction, that not everything he touched turned toxic, that he was capable of sustaining relationships and companies, and hope even when circumstances were difficult. 1 year after their press conference, Nandi stood in front of journalists at a very different kind of announcement. Phoenix Quantum had just closed its largest funding round, valuation at 7 billion rand and climbing. Titanium Capital had expanded into new markets, her leadership unquestioned despite or perhaps because of the very public battle she'd fought. And beside her, as partner and co-founder and the man she'd chosen when the world told her not to. El-Wazi looked like someone who'd finally stopped running and started building. The questions from journalists mixed business specifics with personal curiosity. Nandi answered them with the same controlled authority she'd always brought to public appearances, but with a new ease that suggested she'd made peace with being both powerful and human. "Ms. Cumulo," one journalist asked toward the end, "2 years ago you took significant risks going public with your relationship with Mr. Cumulo and exposing his family's corruption. Knowing what you know now, would you make the same choices?" Nandi looked at El-Wazi, saw him watching her with an expression that still made her breath catch, and smiled. Without hesitation, every single one. Because that was the truth she'd learned through fire and siege, and the messy, beautiful work of building something with someone instead of just for herself. Power was intoxicating, success was satisfying, empire was impressive, but none of it could keep you warm at night or remind you that you were more than your achievements or make you feel genuinely alive. Love did that. Imperfect, complicated, sometimes inconvenient love that demanded vulnerability and offered connection in return. She'd spent 47 years building an empire in isolation. She'd spend however many years she had left building one alongside someone who saw her, really saw her, and chose her anyway. That night, lying in bed with El-Wazi in the Bantry Bay penthouse that had once felt like a beautiful prison, Nandi felt contentment settle over her like warmth. Not the cold satisfaction of a successful acquisition or profitable quarter, but the deep bone piece of being exactly where she wanted with exactly who she wanted. "What are you thinking?" El-Wazi murmured, fingers tracing patterns on her shoulder. "That I'm happy," Nandi said simply. "That choosing you was the best investment I ever made." He laughed, genuinely delighted. "You're comparing our relationship to a business transaction." "I'm comparing it to the best business transaction," Nandi corrected. "The kind where both parties gain more than they risk, where returns compound over time, where value isn't just monetary but transformational." She turned to look at him. "I'm saying I love you in the language I know best." "It's perfect," El-Wazi said, kissing her forehead. "You're perfect. We're perfect together even when we're a mess." "Especially when we're a mess," Nandi agreed. Outside, Cape Town sparkled in darkness, a city of dreams and struggles and people fighting their own battles between what they wanted and what they thought they deserved. Inside, Nandi held the man she loved and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely herself. Not the untouchable billionaire, not the lonely empire builder. Just a woman who'd learned that the most valuable acquisition wasn't wealth or power or influence, but the courage to be vulnerable with someone who'd earned her trust. It had cost her almost everything to learn that lesson. But as El-Wazi's breathing evened into sleep and she felt his warmth against her side, Nandi knew with absolute certainty it had been worth every sacrifice, every risk, every moment of terror when she'd thought loving him would destroy her. Because in the end, it hadn't destroyed her. It had saved her from the slow death of isolation, from the cold comfort of achievement without connection, from the lie that success required loneliness. And if you followed this entire journey, if you've seen what it takes to rebuild from ruins while fighting for both empire and intimacy, then share this story with someone who needs to hear that power and vulnerability can coexist, that it's never too late to choose happiness alongside success, that the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to accept that achievement requires isolation. 2 years became 3, and Phoenix Quantum evolved from startup to established force, their quantum computing applications revolutionizing everything from secure voting systems to climate modeling. Nandi and Elwazi became the kind of partnership people studied in business schools, not despite their complicated beginning, but because of it, their willingness to be transparent about mistakes and vulnerabilities, making them more credible than the carefully curated success stories most executives presented. They still fought about expansion strategy, about work-life balance, about whether to accept government contracts that came with strings attached. But the fights felt different now, more like negotiation between equals than battles for control. They'd learned to trust that disagreement didn't mean dissolution, that they could challenge each other without threatening the foundation of what they'd built together. The election Sibusiso had warned about came and went, with a new minister of digital infrastructure appointed who was genuinely interested in democratic technology applications rather than surveillance capabilities. Phoenix Quantum won several major contracts specifically because their technology enabled transparency instead of control, vindication of everything El-Wazi had been trying to build before his family's corruption had forced his hand. And through it all, Nandi discovered that happiness wasn't the fairy tale she'd dismissed in her 20s or the weakness she'd feared in her 30s and 40s. It was work, daily choice, the conscious decision to prioritize connection alongside achievement. It was messy and complicated and sometimes still terrifying. But it was real, and it was hers, and she'd fought for it with the same ferocity she'd brought to building her empire. On their 3rd anniversary as partners, both business and personal, the lines so blurred now that separating them felt artificial, El-Wazi took her to a private game reserve in Mpumalanga. They sat on the deck of an exclusive lodge watching elephants move through golden grassland, and he pulled out a small box that made Nandi's heart do something complicated in her chest. "Before you panic," El-Wazi said, smiling at her expression, "this isn't what you think it is. Or maybe it is, but not in the way that makes you want to run." "I'm not running," Nandi said, though part of her wanted to, old reflexes screaming that this kind of vulnerability was dangerous, that commitment was a trap, that she should protect herself before he could hurt her. "I know you're not," El-Wazi said gently. "That's why I thought you might be ready for this." He opened the box, revealing not a ring but a key. "I bought a house in Franschhoek wine country, big enough for both of us and all our neuroses, close enough to Cape Town for work but far enough to feel like escape. I want you to move in with me, not as a business decision or strategic alliance, but because I love you and I want to build a life with you that's about more than just empire." Nandi stared at the key, feeling tears threaten that she'd stopped fighting years ago. "That's terrifying." "I know," El-Wazi agreed, "but you're the bravest person I've ever met, and I think you're ready to be brave about this too." She took the key, felt its weight in her palm like possibility and promise, and all the terrifying, beautiful futures she'd convinced herself she didn't want. "I have conditions." "Of course you do," El-Wazi said, laughing. "We keep separate offices. I'm not working from home just because we're cohabiting. And I get final say on interior design because Your aesthetic is early breakdown chic." "Harsh but fair," Elwazi agreed. "What else?" "We host Sunday dinners," Nandi said, surprising herself. "For my brother and whoever you want to invite. I've spent too long isolating success from family. I want to build something different." Elwazi's expression softened into something unbearably tender. "Deal. Anything else?" "Just one more thing," Nandi said, looking at him directly. "If you're going to give me keys to houses, I get to give you keys to boardrooms. I want you on Titanium Capital's full board, not just advisory. Equal partners in everything. Deal?" "Deal," Elwazi said, and kissed her with the kind of joy that made everything they'd fought for feel not just worth it but inevitable, as if all the pain and risk and terror had been leading to exactly this moment, this choice, this beginning. "And if you've stayed with us until the end, if you've witnessed what it takes to rebuild not just companies but lives, not just empires but connections, then you understand that the real revolution isn't in the technology we build or the wealth we accumulate. It's in refusing to accept that power requires isolation, that success demands sacrifice of everything soft and human and vulnerable." Leave a comment about your own journey toward that understanding, and subscribe for more stories about people who choose both achievement and intimacy, who prove daily that you don't have to burn yourself out to build something meaningful. The house in Franschhoek was stone and glass and vineyard views, big enough for privacy and intimate enough to feel like home. They moved in together on a Saturday, Nandi bringing her minimalist elegance and Elwazi bringing his chaotic brilliance, and spent the first week arguing about whether books should be organized by color or subject, and whether the kitchen needed one coffee maker or four. It was domestic and ridiculous and perfect. Sunday dinners became ritual. Manla and his wife and their children coming from Johannesburg, former Cumulo Technologies team members who'd become Phoenix Quantum's core, friends and colleagues, and the extended chosen family they'd both built from people who'd proven themselves trustworthy. Nandi discovered she liked hosting, liked filling her home with voices and laughter instead of just luxury and silence. She was 50 now, her hair more silver than black, her face carrying lines that told stories of battles fought and won. She looked at herself in mirrors and saw someone she barely recognized from a decade ago, still powerful, still formidable, but somehow softer too, more human, less isolated in her perfection. She'd spent so long being untouchable that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be simply touched, to be wanted for who she was instead of what she could provide. Elwazi gave her that daily, not through grand gestures but through small ones. Coffee prepared exactly how she liked it, research papers on topics he knew would interest her, quiet evenings where they worked in comfortable silence punctuated by observations and questions. He saw her, really saw her, and didn't flinch from either her power or her vulnerability. And slowly, painfully, beautifully, Nandi learned to do the same for him. Phoenix Quantum's valuation hit 10 billion rand on a Tuesday morning, making headlines as one of Africa's fastest-growing tech companies. Nandi and Elwazi celebrated alone in their Franschhoek kitchen, with champagne that cost less than the contracts they just signed and laughter that felt more valuable than any profit margin. "We did it," Elwazi said, pulling her close. "Built something revolutionary, proved that you can succeed without corruption, created technology that actually helps people instead of controlling them." "We did," Nandi agreed, "though I seem to remember someone telling me it was impossible when I first proposed this partnership." I was an idiot, Elwazi admitted cheerfully. Depressed, traumatized, convinced that everything I touched turned to ash. You proved me wrong about that too. I didn't prove anything, Nandi corrected. We built it together. That was the point. Neither of us could have done this alone. And that, she realized, was the real lesson. Not that success required sacrifice of everything personal, not that power demanded isolation, not that you had to choose between empire and intimacy. The real lesson was that the most revolutionary thing you could build was partnership. Genuine, equal, complicated partnership, where both people brought their strengths and weaknesses and built something bigger than either could create alone. She'd spent 20 years building an empire by herself because she'd thought that was the only way. She'd spent however many years she had left proving there were other ways, better ways, ways that didn't require burning yourself out to light the path. I love you, she said to El-Wazi, simple words that had taken her 5 decades to learn to say without armor. I know, he said, smiling. You tell me every day, even when you're negotiating hard on contracts or disagreeing with my technical specs. I can hear it in how you fight with me instead of against me. That's very poetic for an engineer, Nandi observed. You're very beautiful for a ruthless corporate titan, El-Wazi countered, and kissed her with the kind of casual affection that still made her heart do complicated things. They finished their champagne watching the sun set over the vineyard, and Nandi thought about the girl she'd been at 20, working 3 jobs and raising her brother, and convinced that success meant sacrifice of everything soft. She thought about the woman she'd been at 30, building empire and pushing away anyone who couldn't keep up. She thought about herself at 40, successful and miserable and absolutely alone. And she thought about who she was now at 50, with silver in her hair and laugh lines on her face, and a partner who saw her completely and chose her anyway. With an empire she'd built, and a life she'd created, and the hard-earned wisdom that you didn't have to choose between achievement and connection. You just had to be brave enough to fight for both. Thank you, she said to El-Wazi, not specifying for what because it was everything. For seeing her, for fighting beside her, for teaching her that vulnerability wasn't weakness and partnership wasn't surrender and love wasn't something you had to sacrifice to stay powerful. Thank you, he echoed, and she knew he understood all the unsaid things too, all the ways they'd saved each other from the slow death of isolation disguised as success. The stars came out over Franschhoek, brilliant and infinite, and Nandi Cumulo, billionaire, empire builder, revolutionary, partner, lover, felt peace settle over her like a blessing she'd finally learned to accept. She'd built kingdoms from nothing, destroyed corruption that seemed untouchable, revolutionized entire industries. But her greatest achievement wasn't any of those things. Her greatest achievement was learning that she didn't have to be untouchable to be powerful, that she could be both fierce and soft, both successful and happy, both empire and intimacy. And if you've journeyed with us through every betrayal and breakthrough, every risk and revelation, then you know that the stories we tell ourselves about success and sacrifice are often lies designed to keep us small and separate. The real truth is bigger and messier and infinitely more beautiful, that we can have both achievement and connection, both power and vulnerability, both empire and love. We just have to be brave enough to fight for all of it, to refuse the false choices that say we have to pick one at the cost of the others. Share this story if you believe in that kind of bravery. Comment if you've lived it. Subscribe if you're still learning it. Because the revolution isn't in the technology we build or the wealth we accumulate. It's in refusing to accept that becoming powerful means becoming alone, that building empires requires sacrificing everything human and soft and vulnerable. The revolution is in proving daily that you can be both and instead of either or, that the most valuable thing you'll ever build is a life that honors all of who you are instead of just the parts that produce profit. Nandi fell asleep that night in El-Wazi's arms, in a house filled with love instead of just luxury, in a life she'd built instead of just endured. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't dream about empire or conquest or the next battle to be won. She dreamed about home and woke up smiling, and knew that was the real victory after all. The end. If this story moved you, if you saw yourself in Nandi's journey from isolation to connection, from untouchable to loved, then share it with someone who needs permission to want it all: the success and the softness, the empire and the intimacy. Comment with your own story of choosing bravery over safety. And follow for more tales about people who refuse to accept that power requires loneliness, who prove daily that the most revolutionary act is building a life that honors every part of who you are.